We're the two teachers.
Welcome to Room to Be, where it's time to get schooled.
We're talking about foundations, the foundations of American government and politics. And in particular today, we're looking at those historical events that led up to the ratification of our Constitution.
Well, in those historical events, you have to start with the Declaration of Independence, which is where our founders, Thomas Jefferson specifically, talked about our ideals of our founding of our government, but they also laid out the excuses as to why we were breaking away from our colonial mother.
A revolutionary moment in time, Andy. It's a time in which the people revolted against the generational idea that we're not equal, that some are more privileged than others. We declared our independence from that idea. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
But it really wasn't just people breaking away, it was also colonies breaking away. Breaking away because they thought the central government of Great Britain, with its king and its parliament, had become abusive of its powers and had overstepped limited government. So when we start creating a new government in the Articles of Confederation, those colonies were now called states. And their main point was to keep the power of the central government very weak, because that was the whole point of the Revolutionary War, was to break away from this abusive central government.
Well, somewhat encouraging perhaps to us today, Andy, our first attempt at a government ruled by the people didn't work very well. The Articles of Confederation failed, and they failed in a number of ways, but they did succeed in this. They did succeed in demonstrating that a people can self-govern, that we were able to finish the American Revolution under the Articles of Confederation. We were able to think about adding territories under the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation protected individual liberty, but they didn't work very well.
Well, there are significant weaknesses, particularly because central government was so weak. There was no executive to enforce the laws. The Congress at the time could ask for taxes, but it was up to states to voluntarily pay them. There was no uniform law across the states. Each state had their own set of laws, and particularly when it came to trade and interstate trade, taking goods from one state to another, the central government had no authority to expedite that trade, and so you really had 13 different countries that had very little unification, particularly when you're trying to grow an economic power to compete with Great Britain.
The tipping point, Andy, though, of that Articles of Confederation and its failures was an historical event that we call the Shays Rebellion. The Articles of Confederation had a hard time enforcing its laws. And likewise, in some of the states, rebellions broke out. Bankers were trying to hound back and get their debts paid from the war, and some of the farmers in Massachusetts said, listen, you owe us from the war. We fought that revolution for you, and rebellions broke out. The Shays Rebellion is the best example, and it was because of that revolt that the elite, those that had put together the ideas and the articles, said, maybe we need to go back and revisit. And so they called for a new constitutional convention in a way to address the failures of the articles.
And James Madison, the father of the Constitution, came with a plan, the Virginia Plan, that was bolstered by delegates from New York like Alexander Hamilton, who wanted to create this stronger central government, while all the time at the convention was this battle, a couple of different battles. One was, how do we keep this government from becoming too powerful? And the other was, how do we make sure that states are represented fairly? And so you had competing plans. You had some states, the smaller states, who wanted equal representation, the same way it had been under the Articles of Confederation, where each state had equal power in this new bicameral Congress. And other delegates from the larger states, like Virginia, wanted their states to have more voting power in both the House and the Senate, because those states had a higher population.
So in that hot, sultry summer of 1787, we learned some important lessons. That yes, we can self-govern, but we have to admit our mistakes. And yes, if we want to self-govern in the future, we will need to compromise. And so we're talking about many of these compromises, like the Great Compromise. How do we balance that tension between the large states and the small states? And they agreed. The Great Compromise gave us that bicameral legislature. but then became that prickly issue. What do we do about slavery? And Andy, the compromise sounds kind of strange to us today, but there's a brilliant thread in that fabric. We're talking about the 3/5 compromise.
And both of those compromises are about how do you represent states and their population. And with that great compromise, the House has proportional representation, where the more populated states have more members in the House. The Senate obviously has equal representation, each state getting 2 votes. But then the big question became, what about these giant states with large slave populations? Should they get representatives in the House to make their power bigger in the House, even though these slaves aren't even considered citizens and would never have the right to vote? And that's where the 3/5 compromise came in, which essentially gave slave states more power than they really deserved because of their large slave populations.
But
each slave counting as 3/5 of a person in the census.
The irony, Andy, is the slave states wanted their slaves to count as a full person in the apportionment of power in the House of Representatives. It became that prescient view in the North that this would give the southern states way too much power in the future. The northern states were looking for ways to get rid of slavery. And so they agreed to the compromise, 3/5 compromise, which reduced the voting authority of southern states. Andy, this is where the history of our founding becomes so interesting. But remember, ratifying that Constitution didn't come simple, nor was it easy. And so there were a series of essays that we call the Federalist Papers that were written by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay to try to convince those recalcitrant states to ratify this new and revolutionary document.
Well, the Federalist Papers were propaganda papers, and they were really meant to get the Constitution ratified, especially in the big states of New York and Virginia. And you should know some of those key Federalist Papers, like Federalist 10, which discuss why these large states, which have Republican governments, are good to get factions to work together. Instead of having a majority always stamp out the rights of the minority, it's good to have these large republics where different groups of citizens join together in regards of working together and bridging across instead of always quashing the rights of minorities.
Say, Andy, one lesson we're learning today when we look at historical events, and that is our Constitution, our way of government, is a work in progress. We're not going to say that 200 years ago we solved the riddle and now we live by those words. We're evolving, we're changing, we're continuously compromising. And Andy, this is one of the most important lessons that we learn, that our form of government, we're not done yet. It's a work in progress. We're the 2 teachers, and you've been schooled in room 2B.
Where there's always room to be an informed citizen.